Hi, I'm Katie Rodgers, and over the past few months, I've been working to create a Halloween costume design for Time Princess, a hyper-realistic 3D story dress-up game. My inspiration for the costume began with amazing vintage clown and Harlequin looks. After creating a few concepts, she transformed into the Harlequin of Hearts, a playful character in a vintage-style tutu. Once the costume design was finished, I worked with a costume maker to bring the idea to life three-dimensionally. The costume became a reality, which then carried my model into another world as the Harlequin of Hearts. Time Princess is a hyper-realistic 3D story dress-up game. Imagine getting lost in a world of books with stories that take you on magical adventures between reality and fantasy. I created the Harlequin of Hearts Halloween dress for Time Princess, where you can craft the costume to dress up your character inside the game. Your magical adventure will start here.